I know what was part of like the original plan. I know, I have a list of all the people.
Do we have enough seats for everyone? Well, this lecture series is a culmination of a wonderful group of people working to honor Walter Durham. Many of you knew him personally. I moved here 50 years ago, and he's one of the first people I met because we went to the Methodist church together, and he sat on the second pew on the left, and all the Tompkins people sat on the second pew to the right. So he always had stories to tell, and I can tell you I've read most of his books. Kenneth Thomson, our speaker tonight, can tell you how many books he wrote. Kenneth collaborated with Walter Durham on many of his books, and they were very good friends. Now, Kenneth lives in the historic district of Gallatin. He grew up in the historic district. He's very involved with the Sumner County Museum, the Sumner County Historical Society, and if he isn't at home, he's in the archives. So he's very well known for his interest in history. And he and my husband, Tommy, grew up in the same neighborhood, so they've known each other for 70 plus years. I met Walter Durham when I first moved here 50 years ago, and I just think he was such a delightful person. And I believe that Anna, his wife, and his 4 children, Tommy and Bob and Jim and Elizabeth, would really love the fact that all the memorial money that was sent to Friends of the Library that we're using to present this lecture series. So I'd like for Ken Thomson to come up and give you the first in the 4 series of lectures, and at the end you'll have time for questions and answers.
If this is a flop, it's her fault. And I'm here tonight just to ruin somebody's birthday. Mike Binkley. Happy birthday, Mike. How many people in here have not read any of Walter's books? How many people have read The Great Leap? Now the second book is the one you skim through because it's like this. Old Sumner. How many people have read Old Sumner? Now most people don't read Old Sumner. They use it as a reference book. So we were going to talk about that as soon as I find the page. History is a way of life. It is never ending. The rewards are perpetual. And one famous person said this, and that's me. People in their lives constitute a way of life both past and present, with a culmination of a known and unknown past. You are in the process of creating your own legacy. And I remind people of that often. I said, your legacy is going to end up in the Sumner County Archives. One of these days I'm going to be editing it. Where do we find this quotation? The heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. It's carved on a building in Washington, D.C. Nobody knows. The National Archives. Walter Thomas Durham was a consummate historian with an insatiable desire to preserve history. His initial seed was planted in 1969 when he issued the first book, The Great Leap Westward. That laid a substantial foundation for the 23 books to come. And he wrote them all by hand. Of course, Glenda had to type them, but he wrote them by hand. I'm going to briefly go over the first 2 books from the table of contents and just give you a little foundation, and I'm going to expound on some of the others a little bit. I'm not going to give you a lot of information because if you don't have these books, I merely, you need to go to the Sumner County Archives and buy them. Because we've got them all there, and we've had some of them reprinted, some of them been reprinted twice. I call The Great Leap Westward the book for beginners because that sort of lays the first foundation, the first layer, and it sort of tells you where you are and what's going on. And the first chapter is on geography because that's always important. Why did people come to this area? Water, as well as land. And of course, we're lucky we have the Cumberland River out here, and that's the reason this county was pretty wealthy in the early days because they could send all their goods to Natchez and New Orleans, you know. He talks about the Native Americans, the first inhabitants here. And then the early exploration. The first explorers were fur traders and long hunters. And of course, the most famous long hunter was Timothy de Montgomery, who lived in a cave in Nashville on the river. And of course, there were numerous fur traders. And then there were the long hunters who came in here. And they were groups of men from East Tennessee that came in here and stayed from spring to fall and hunted and collected pelts and things. And those two groups didn't cause too much trouble with the Indians. Some of the Indians didn't like them, but there wasn't too much animosity. But what really did them in was when they brought the first permanent settlement to Nashville. General James Robertson brought the men and livestock by land from East Tennessee, and Carrie Mabry's great-grandfather, Colonel John Donaldson, brought the flotilla to Nashville. Can you hear me, Carrie?
I can.
Okay. And Carrie was there.
He's exactly right.
And I was right behind her. I was just a little smaller than she. Well, in 1779, Robertson got to Nashville on Christmas Eve, and they were on the wrong side of the river, and they didn't know how they were going to get to the other side with all the livestock. Well, the river froze that night, and they walked across the next day. Well, Donaldson froze up in East Tennessee, and it took him till April to get to Nashville. But anyway, they ended up there, all of them by April, and they had to form a government. So they all signed the Cumberland Compact, about 265 people, and 99% of them could read and write. They began at that point having trouble with the Indians. There were 4 tribes that used this for the happy hunting ground. And they weren't too happy when all these settlers came in and started building cabins and clearing fields and planting crops. So the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creeks, and Shawnees had a fit. And we had to fight the Indian Wars from 1780 to 1795 when the last man was killed in Sumner County. Sumner County government was formed in 1787, the state in 1796, and Gallatin in 1802. And Gallatin beat out Cairo by 1 vote because Cairo was the port city, and that's where you went to ship everything from. And it was quite a sizable town, and it was a lot of houses there. And if you go to the deeds office or the archives, you'll see that there were many lots, town lots sold off, and people built houses there. Of course, all that was gone. There are a couple of original buildings there. During all this turmoil, despite the Indians, from 1780 to 1800, there were substantial houses built. The first one was Rockcastle, Hendersonville, 1783. The second one was the William Bowen House, 1788 at Goodlettsville. The third one, and I bet you don't know where this is, the Pierce Wall House in 1793. And it's a miniature of Craigfront. And then Craigfront 1798, and then the Austin House at Portland in the 1790s. We don't know exactly what year. Anybody know where the Pierce Wall House is? It's called Walnut Grove. Does that help you any?
Yes.
Don Wright lives in that house. Okay, of course, the people all these settlers that came here brought religion with them, but they didn't have churches, of course, in the beginning, and most of the Virginians were members of the Church of England. And when they came here, the Presbyterians were the first missionaries on the frontier, so everybody joined the Presbyterian Church because there was no Church of England here. And then the Methodists was second. Of course, Shiloh was the first church out here behind Enoch's Animal Hospital. The cemetery still up there, 1791. And Strother's Meeting House at Cottontown. And then the Baptists, they were Methodists, then the Baptists ambled in. And then in 1800, they had the Great Revival in Kentucky. Alarm. Is that time to stop? Okay. In 1800 at Cane Ridge, you know where that is, Bourbon County, Kentucky, they had the Great Revival, and that's where it began. And of course, it wound up coming down here, and Barton Stone, who was one of the big preachers up there, ended up marrying one of the Boyne daughters at Goodlettsville. And so he was preaching down here in around 1812. The first school in this area, in this Davidson, Sumner County, was Davidson Academy. And they had a few little schools sort of scattered around. And they had social activity, and the most important social activity to me was the horse business, race horses, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Tall Men on the Sumner Frontier is the title of one of the chapters. And who was the Hercules of Sumner County? Thomas Sharpe Spencer. Spent the first one in 1775 in the front lawn of Wynwood and a hollow sycamore tree. Well, they have a person who lives up there that portrays him, and he performed a couple of Sundays ago at Wynwood. And the question came up how long that tree was there. And I think the remnant of the trunk, of course it was a huge tree, but the remnants of the lowest part of the tree was there until 1905 to 1910. But in 1896, they cut the best part of it and made furniture and different items for the Tennessee Centennial. It took place in 1897. And they made a cabinet mantel that was put in the library at Fairview. I don't know whether it's still there or not, because I haven't been in there since the house has changed. But anyway, that's from Spencer's tree. Of course, the Bledsoe brothers were big on the frontier, and Casper Mansker at Goodlettsville, and many others. And I can't go into all of that, I just touch on it. This first book is 25 years, 1780 to 1805. And the last chapter is 25 years and no turning back. Towns, commerce, government, and social institutions established during this time still exist to the present day. And at that early date, Sumner County became the jumping off place. And people were going west that early. If everybody had stayed here that came here, we couldn't walk outside. They started going west early. The second book is the biggest book that he did. And we ran out of them, and I couldn't get him to have them reprinted in his lifetime, so as Imperial President of the Historical Society, we reprinted that book. And it's a thick book and crammed full of information. So it's sort of a follow-up to The Great Leap, and those are the two most important books that he did, in my opinion. And of course, some of the others in more detail about certain areas of history. But Old Sumner was from 1805 to 1861. A portrayal of local behavior and attitudes were characteristic of the rising West. People who lived here, what they did, how they did it, and why they did it. There were departures for the wars, resettlement to the West, gold fields, up to secession. Now this book's in 3 sections. The first section is 1805 to 1828. And the first chapter is second generation on the Cumberland. Well, the first generation came here and settled. The second accumulated. The third spent. And that was, the third generation was just prior to the Civil War, and that was the golden age of the South, which will come up again in a little bit. My favorite subject is in the third chapter, and that's the sport of kings. And that is the horse business. And Dr. Redmond Dillon Barry brought racehorses and bluegrass to Middle Tennessee. And he lived down on the Nashville Pike where Wilder Dotson lives. Anybody know Wilder Dotson? That's where his house was. And the first horse was Gray Medley in 1800. And he brought that horse and stabled it at Goodlettsville on the Nashville Gallatin Pike at William Donaldson's. William Donaldson was the son of Colonel John that came to Nashville with flotilla. And McHenry Center is built on that property. And the McHenrys were the last ones to live in that old brick house. But anyway, after the horse had been stabled there a while, Barry brought him to Gallatin and then added to the collection. And also the bluegrass because of the limestone soil. But Walter did not have a follow-up book on this subject. He did on some of these others I'll talk about in a moment. But he did not follow up on this because the definitive book on racehorses had already been done and was done in 1916 by James Douglas Anderson. And it is a wonderful book. It tells you everything you need to know about making the American Thoroughbred is the title. From 1800 to 1845, Sumner County was the largest racing center in the United States and held the most races. And Tennessee, of course, was the #1 racing state. Kentucky was second. Now, Cairo continued as, this is just an expansion of the other book, Cairo continued as Center of Commerce and Gallatin as county seat. Now, at the end of this period, the first history of Sumner County was written. And I bet nobody in this room knows what that was. 1812. Isaac Clark wrote a history of Sumner County. And to me, it's a book about like this. It's a small book. It's crammed full of information, but to me, the most interesting thing is the list of subscribers who subscribe to it are in the back. He made them pay for it first. And then he published it. And in Walter's book, in the appendix, he lists those subscribers. And if you have ancestors here, you're going to find I have my ancestor and I have the book. So I have other ancestors who bought books, and I have the receipts where they bought them in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, you know. How many people have got something like that, you know? No money, just books, you know. It's like I called a guy one time, African American, and he was a distant relative of mine in Kentucky, and we were talking about our mutual ancestor. In fact, I'm going to talk about the son of the mutual ancestor after a while. But I was talking to him, and he's a big farmer up there. He's dead now, but he was in his 80s when I talked to him. And I said, well, I have a picture. I said, I have a picture of my ancestor, Talton Embry. He said, well, I've got his land. That put me down. Duh. Okay, in 1812, they also got involved in the War of 1812 and the first Seminole War in Florida at the same time. And the muster roll for that war is in this book, too. So if you have ancestors from here in the War of 1812, you can look at back and it'll tell you who they were. And there's some controversy over this, but I think Sumner County became the volunteer county, volunteer state in the War of 1812, because they sent more volunteers to that war than any other war, any other county. And a lot of people think it's the Mexican War, which was 1846-48, but I differ with them on that. Okay, part 2 of this book, 1828-49. Now this is another quiz question. See how smart Kerry Rutledge is now. He was smarter than me in school, so. And I think he knows the answer to this. Sumner County produced a first lady of a foreign country in 1829. Connected to 1829. Anybody know who that was?
Eliza.
Was what?
Eliza.
Yeah. Anybody know who Eliza is? Eliza Helen Houston, Sam Houston's first wife. She was First Lady of Tennessee first, of course. She married him, they weren't married a few weeks. They separated. He went to Arkansas and lived with an Indian woman, then on to Texas. Became President of the Republic of Texas in 1836 and finally got a divorce in 37. So she was First Lady of the Republic of Texas for a year and never went there. And she's the most visited grave in the Gallatin Cemetery for outsiders, you know. Second Seminole War in 1836, and people like Governor Transylvania and Josephus Congill went to that war, and of course the muster roll for that is in this book, which is interesting. Then they had progress in agriculture and slavery and slave trade. And I'm going to tell you just a little story about I'm not going into detail. Walter wrote a story on these sisters, but I'm not going to get in. I'm just going to tell you a brief story about it. The Bank sisters lived up here on East Main, across from Captain D's, where the clinic used to be, the doctor's clinic, you know,
More.
And there was an old house there, and my grandmother remembered it when she was growing up, and that's where the Bank sisters lived, and they had a private school before the Civil War. Well, the last one died during the Civil War, and they were unmarried. And they left their estate basically to the African Americans. But it stated in there that they would take the money from their estate and send them to Liberia and give them money to buy property over there and that kind of thing. Well, anyway, the Civil War changed all that, so they ended up with the property here. And were living there until 1913, and one of the descendants came in the archive not long ago, looking up that property and the deeds and all that, which I thought was interesting. But anyway, my grandmother remembered all that. Education and schools were progressing, and really this section, part 2, should be in part 1 on schools. The first girls' school in this county was at Foxworth Hall, and that was the school building. And it was built in 1807 by Simon Hunt, and Hunt's Female Academy. And all the history books, including the 2 that I did with D.G. Lester and Walter's books, say that Thomas Babel built that house. That's not so. When I finally did the research on it, Simon Hunt built that house. And when he sold it to Thomas Babel in 1829, it states in that deed that the brick schoolhouse was on the property. And if you've been in Foxworth Hall, in the back hall it has 2 stairways facing each other. And it was built that way because it was a schoolhouse. So, and when he bought that, Thomas Babel bought that, he paid like $14.50 an acre or something for it. When the people around that property, buying similar property, were paying $2.50 an acre for it. And that also proves the brick schoolhouse was there. So that was a big brick house, and they tore the back wing off of it when they restored it, or renovated it. They didn't restore it. Okay, then in the year before that, they built a boys' school up here, and that building's still there. And John Garrett owned it. It's behind his house, and directly behind Dr. Moore's clinic up on the hill, that house with the columns on it. That was Transylvania Academy, and it was a school for boys, and the state authorized that school in 1806. Religion was progressing, and on Cemetery Street they built a house, a brick church, and I know the spot, across from the Gallatin Cemetery, and all the churches in town used it. It was a community church. And the first 2 churches that built buildings was the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church. The Cumberland building is gone, but the first Presbyterian Church building is still there from 1836. In this same time period, 28 to 49, the Mexican War took place. And of course, the muster roll for that's in here. And we have one of the few Mexican monuments in the United States, but you could say the world, to that war. There's one in Mexico City, and I think they're a total of 13. And that one has been reworked several times. And when I came in as Imperial President of the Historical Society in 2000. They'd already gotten the money together, and it was dedicated when I was president. Spent $20,000 on that marker, restoring it. And of course, most of those people who went to the Mexican War died of disease and not in battle. Part 3, 1849 to 1861, the golden age of the South. And the best part of the golden age was the gold rush in 1849. And of course, Walter wrote a book about that, and I'll mention that later. Now, book number 3, 1974, small book, but full of information. A college for this community. And I'll just briefly mention that Wirt College was the first school in 1838 that issued master's degrees in Sumner County. And that school was up on what is now the Transylvania County line. Transylvania County wasn't there in those days, on 231. And a few years later, they sold out to Enon, and it became Enon College. And a lot of people still call that area up there Enon College. But I'm not going to dwell on that. The school with the biggest impact on Sumner County was Howard Female College. And it changed names a couple of times. But in the 1840s, the International Order of Oddfellows bought it, the Howard Lodge. And it became, in the last 80 years, it was called Howard Female College. Well, when Walter was writing this book, I was talking to him one day, and he said, well, I'll finish the chapter on Howard Female College. I said, really? So I said, I think I have some information I need to get to you. So I took him some information. He called me back 2 or 3 days later. He said, I have to rewrite the whole chapter to get that information. I said, good. So this is where I'm going to deviate, and I'm going to tell you some things that are not in that book and expound on this. The golden age of that school was from 1856 to 1861. And the president of that school was Joseph Smith Fowler. Joseph Smith Fowler was from Steubenville, Ohio. He was educated at New Athens, Ohio at Franklin College. He went from there to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and studied law under Joseph Rogers Underwood. And at that point, he was offered a position at a new college in Nashville called Franklin College that was built on Elm Craig Farm. It's now part of the Nashville Metro Airport. And that school was founded, and I'm going to get into Lee Fowler for a minute and get into the founding of the school. It was founded by Talbot Fanning and his equal partner, Bowling Embry. Well, Talbot Fanning, of course, was the most eminent minister of the Christian church in Tennessee, but he didn't have enough money to build that school, so he enlisted his friend Bowling Embry to help him. Well, Bowling Embry came from Richmond, Kentucky. His father was Talton Embry, who land I was talking about a moment ago that I don't own. And so Bowling Embry graduated, and this is another quiz. He graduated from a university in Kentucky that was the first one built west of the Appalachian Mountains. In the 1820s was the golden age of that school. It had a medical school and a law school, and it was just a wonderful institution under Dr. Horace Hawley. And I bet you don't know what that was.
Transylvania?
Yes, Transylvania. Transylvania University. Still going today and owned by the Disciples of Christ. Okay, he graduated. Well, he fell in love with Louisa Howard from Mount Sterling. She was from a wealthy family. Of course, he wasn't from a poor family, but he wanted to have some money to get married. So he and a group of friends went to St. Louis. They all met in St. Louis, and they each bought up a bunch of goods. It doesn't say what kind of goods. And the 70 made a trek to Santa Fe. and sold their goods, and he got enough money to get married, came back, married in 1826, went to Alabama, Russellville, Alabama, stayed for about 10 years, came to Gallatin. This is where we come back into Gallatin. Bought a house on East Main Street that's still there, and you know, everybody knows who the last occupant was of that house. John Garrett. They bought that house. Lived there until 1844 when they built Franklin College and moved down there. Franklin College, there are pictures of it. It was a substantial school and had a 3.5-story main building with the classrooms and the dormitory for the boys, and a house for the Embry's and a house for the Fannings. And you didn't have to pay to go there. You just had to work the farm. And David Lipscomb went to school there. That's where he was educated. Ever hear of him? Okay. And of course, he started the Bible school in Nashville, then it became David Lipscomb, then it became Lipscomb University. And his brother went to school at Franklin College. But anyway, Fowler, going back to Joseph Smith Fowler, he came there as a professor when it was a new school. He fell in love with Bowling Embry's daughter, Mariah Louisa, and married her. Well, he stayed there a while and then went to Washington Institute, which was another private school in Nashville that's long gone. And while he was there, he was called as president of Howard Female College in Gallatin, 1856. Well, in 1861, because he was the most successful president of that school, 61, Civil War came. And he was a staunch Unionist. And he and his family moved to Illinois to get away from here. Well, of course, in early 62, Tennessee fell and was under the Governor Andrew Johnson military rule. And so Johnson got in touch with Fowler and had him to come to Nashville and made him comptroller of Tennessee. Of course, in late 64, Johnson was on the ticket with Mr. Lincoln, and they got elected and went to Washington when Mr. Lincoln got shot and Johnson became president. In 66, Tennessee re-entered the Union. Joseph Smith Fowler became the first U.S. Republican senator after the Civil War, and the last one to Howard Baker, last Republican. Well, Mr. Johnson got in trouble while he was president. He had Edward McMaster Stanton, of course, he didn't appoint, but he was Secretary of War, and he didn't like him, and he fired him and put General Ulysses S. Grant, another relative of mine, in that office. Well, the House of Representatives impeached him, and so Grant immediately resigned because he didn't want to be a part of that, and of course he was elected president right after that. And they put Stanton back in there, but they impeached Johnson. But to be prosecuted, you have to go to the Senate, and the Senate has to vote on removing you from office. You have to be tried by the Senate. Well, they tried him in the Senate, and it has to be 2/3 majority. And one person's vote prevented him from being prosecuted and thrown out of office. Whose vote was that? Joseph Smith Fowler. And that prompted Walter Thomas Durham to write an extensive article on Joseph Smith Fowler for the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, which he did, and that year he presented that program at the annual dinner at the Hermitage Hotel. But, and I'll tell you a little more about something else in a minute, but anyway, when I read the article that he wrote, I called Walter, and I always took pleasure in pointing out his mistakes. He didn't actually make this mistake, but it was a mistake. It wasn't his fault. But anyway, he put in there that Joseph Smith Fowler married the widowed daughter of President Andrew Johnson. I said, that's completely erroneous. I know who he married. He didn't have one wife, and she was my great-great-grandmother's sister. And I have a portrait in my house. I said, I want to know your reference for that. Well, it didn't take him too long. He came back with a reference, and it was a congressional record in Washington. And somebody, I don't know how it got there, who made it up, put it in there, but it was totally wrong, you know. But you can't know all those things. I mean, there's no way, because Walter was never into genealogy. And he didn't want to remember genealogy too much. I mean, he was into other things, but not in genealogy. Well, anyway, that's enough on that. In 1976, he did a book on General Daniel Smith, and that's the most interesting book, and all I can say about him is he was a revolutionary soldier. He gave Tennessee its name. He's the one that named our state. He was a senator, he was a surveyor, built the earliest house. His great-granddaughter owned Hendersonville most of her life. Nanny Smith buried. She owned 5,000 acres of land down there. She owned Hazel Path, Eventide, Rockcastle, Darlington Place, and Tulip Grove over by the Hermitage. So if you don't think she was in control, and she lived to be 100 years old. The next book was the General Winchester book from '79. And I've got something to tell you about this. I'm not going into detail about it because he was a founder of Memphis and general in the Revolutionary War. But Walter gave the first book review at the college in the auditorium, and I was on the front row, and he got up to speak, and he said, looked down at me in the hole, and he said, I know Kenneth Thomson hadn't finished reading that book, and I was looking at him, I thought, how does he know that? He said, I haven't got my list of corrections. 1982, he did Rebellion Revisited, which is about the Civil War in Gallatin. And he had access to some wonderful material, but 12 years ago, I came into a diary that we didn't know about. A lady from Lebanon owned an antique mall called me. She said, something over here you need to come up over here and buy. The lady's brought in, and it was Mary Robertson Shell's diary. And she lived up here where the General Dollar is, not General Dollar, Family Dollar, on East Main. And the main part of the diary is August through December 1862. And it's absolutely wonderful. And the Historical Society, which I'm still president, Imperial President, has published it. It will be available in about 3 weeks. And it will be presented to the public. And it's just a wonderful thing. She was a well-educated person and a charter member of the Presbyterian Church. Her husband was a jeweler, silversmith here. Samuel Fox Shell, her son was a doctor. One of the doctor's sons was a doctor here. Dr. Henry Augustus Shell, and he has a descendant that lives out on Long Hollow Pike, and his name is Henry Augustus Shell. And all the Wilmores here are descendants of Dr. Shell and Mary, the great-grandmother Mary. But anyway, that's a book to look forward to, I think. In 85 and 87, he wrote 2 Civil War books on Nashville. 1986, the first coffee table book, A Pictorial History with Dr. Thomas. And then 1995, my favorite book that he did, Celebration of Houses Before 1900, with Dr. Thomas and John Creasy. Well, in 95, that book in 95 was 3 years before D.G. Lester and I did 2 volumes in 98. And I made some corrections on some mistakes in that book. I didn't correct all of them because I made some mistakes in mine. Believe it or not, I made a mistake or 2. And Walter took pride and called me, and he found one. And he called me, you made a mistake. I said, really? Anyway, D.G. and I did those 2 books, and we corrected some things. But it wasn't until 2 years ago that Rockcastle published a book on homes. And it's called Historic Rockcastle Presents Historic Sumner County. And all those houses in that book are standing, and all the pictures in color. Robin Hood, award-winning photographer, made the pictures. James A. Crutchfield wrote it. I edited it and proofed it. And as far as I know, it's the most definitive book on houses in Sumner County, because I took time this time to correct all the errors that I had made and Walter had made in his books. And one of them was the Foxworth Hall story, because going way back to the early part of the century, that it was published that Thomas Babel built Foxworth Hall, and of course he didn't do it. So we got that corrected. So if you don't have that book, it's $50 and you can buy it at Rockcastle. 1997, he did the book on the gold rush, the 49ers, and it's a great book. And of course, every time you do a book, all this information comes to light that's been hidden somewhere. So we have some information that he didn't have for this book. Now in 2002, he and Glenda did the Gallatin 200 book, and it's a chronological book, and it's a good book, coffee table book. The same year he came out with Josephus, Con, Gill, and Rosemont. Judge Gill was a very interesting person. Of course, he made his money on longhorn cattle, as well as being a lawyer and with racehorses. And he handled cases that defended the Indians and the African Americans. He was good about doing both. And then 2 years later, the Bailey Payton book came out. Well, Bailey Payton and Gill were like this, and Bailey Payton lived in New Orleans. And so Gill was always going down there to visit. And he liked the Creole designs of the houses down there, so that's the reason he built Rosemont the way he did. Every room opened out on an open porch. And of course, that was good in New Orleans, but up here you froze your butts off going from winter to wintertime, you know. And by the way, when he went to 1836, that house was started, and as soon as he got it started, he went off to war. And his wife had a building out there in the front yard, and she supervised the building of that house, the initial part of it, center section. And then the last coffee table book they did in 2010 was the Grasslands International Steeplechase Foundation book, which is a wonderful book. Well, Farrell Hale got me in trouble 2 years ago. Anybody know him?
Yeah.
He called me the last week in April 2015, and he said, you know, we're going to dedicate the new 109 bridge to Walter Durham. I said, yeah, I know. And my family didn't want anybody there. And the word did get out, and there were a few people there, but they really didn't want anybody there. And I said, who's going to do it? He said, you are. I said, me? And I thought a minute, and I thought, well, I know why. Bill Pereira can't stand up and everybody else is dead, and by process of elimination, I can't convict him. So after he said it has to be less than 5 minutes.
Oh, really?
So I went, he said, you're the only speaker, and I was. But I went and I just had a little card, note card. I didn't write out a speech, because I don't like to read things. I'm having to read more as I get old. And since I'm old, Carrie, I have to have notes now. I didn't used to have notes. But anyway, after it was over with, then I had two people that wanted to copy the speech. Well, I didn't have a speech. I have a copy of it. So I had to go and pull Bonnie at the archives. She and I labored through this, and I dictated it to her, and she typed it up. And I went over it again. But anyway, I'm going to read you all what I said, because not many people were there, and I'm going to bore you as much as I did the few that were there. So, we're here today to honor one of our native sons, Walter Thomas Durham, who left an indelible mark of excellence etched in the annals of Sumner County in our state of Tennessee. This bridge is the ultimate fruition of a dream come true, originating with J. Tom Durham, the grandfather of the person that we honor here today. This project was thwarted 86 years ago by the Great Depression. This magnificent structure is appropriately named after a gentleman who believed in the great Cicero, who once said, to be ignorant of what happened before you were born is to live the life of a child forever. He lived his life in the pursuit of removing historical ignorance from our mind by creating a great legacy for us in 24 volumes of recorded history that he produced. He was a true gentleman of the highest caliber, one of the vanishing breed, a great humanitarian, a friend as well as a beloved state historian. He also served as president of the Tennessee Historical Society, was the founding president of the Tennessee Preservation Trust and the Sumner County Historical Society. I am honored to be the president of the latter group. He additionally was involved in a multiplicity of organizations and societies too numerous to mention. Through the years, I assisted him primarily in genealogical research, prompting him to bestow the title on me. Ready for this, Mary Lee? The man who knows the most dead people in Sumner County than anybody. I cling to this designation with great tenacity. This structure is a great leap from the canoe and the woods ferry of yesteryear. It will bring much travel pleasure to the multitudes of the future, as will the writings of the great man that we honor here today, Mr. Walter Thomas Durham. And also, as I once wrote, that was in the speech, but as I once wrote in the book review on Rosemont Gill book, and this applies to all the books, of course, that he wrote. This book is a treasure as well as its author. As long as our stories are told, we live on. Through history, he and we are immortal. Through history, life is a continuous voyage of exploration and discovery. Amen. Put too many people to sleep. I saw two. Grace?
Tell me about the name of the house you live in.
Ryan Scottie? Well, for many years we thought it was the house that Gustav Ryan lived in, who was a photographer here. But actually it was the house next door, and the lady that actually built it was Margaret Jane Lowry. And she never lived in it. She just built it and owned it and lived out where Will Jane Blackmore lived. Yeah. That's where she lived, the Lowry place.
Is there no connection to Hattie Wings?
No, Hattie Love lived there.
Oh, Hattie Love, okay.
Yeah, she lived there for many years. He Love's aunt. Yeah. Yeah. No other famous people that I know of who live there except me. Really?
You sort of misquoted me. I did not say that you knew more dead people. Well, I may have said that too. But really the thing I said, he was raised by grandparents. And I said, you must have been the nosiest little boy that ever was, because you said at the knee of your grandmother and grandfather, and you not only know all this history, but you know all the dirt. Gossip on everybody too.
I'm like Johnny Maddox. I could publish a book, a good book, but it had to be published posthumously. I can. I could embarrass several people in this room right now.
But you'd be embarrassing your kinfolks.
I know. I'm like Danny Dunn. I'll be the first to tell you the truth. She can tell you the truth on herself, even. You know, some of the people.
Not Carrie, your other child.
No, not Carrie. No. Any more questions?
What was the name of the person with that diary again?
Mary Robertson Shell. And Samuel Fox Shell.
The book, A College for This Community. I think I remember reading that Middle Tennessee State would have been here except for one vote or something along that line.
The county court refused to let MTSU come here yet. There's a lot of good information in that book. There were two colleges here that were never built. And one was the Isaac Franklin Institute at Fairview, which was more heavily endowed, much more heavily endowed than Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt just gave $75,000 to Vanderbilt. And Isaac Franklin gave $500,000 in his will to found the Isaac Franklin Institute. Of course, his wife wrote the will and got it all. That's another story. But the interesting part of that story is she thwarted his efforts to set up that school in perpetuity, and said in the will it was to educate the descendants of his brothers and sisters and the needy children of Sumner County, which would have included everybody. But she thwarted the efforts and went to Louisiana District Court, wrote the will on the technicality that an institution and the institutions he owned in Louisiana, the 6 plantations, could not support the school up here at Fairview. So then she married Isaac Franklin for money. He married her for love. Then she married Colonel Joseph Alexander Smith Ackland. He married her for money and she married him for love. And the story there is he was a jack-leg reprobate lawyer from Huntsville, Alabama. And he was a drinker and a gambler and all this. And he was heavily indebted to his gambling cronies. And he told them if they would stake him to a new horse and carriage and wardrobe, he'd marry the widow Franklin and pay the debt. And so they did. He did and she did. And anyway, that got done. And then she was miserable with him for 13 years, and he finally died. And then she married Dr. William Cheatham. Well, their feelings were mutual. We married for companionship, you know, no problem there. But I think that two more interesting facts were her house became an educational institution in Belmont. And her son, William Hayes Ackland, who lived in Washington, who never married and left a huge estate in 1940, and he left it to Duke University. And they refused it because the stipulation was they had to take his body in a sarcophagus and build this art museum and put a separate room there for his sarcophagus. Marble sarcophagus with a bronze statue laying across it. They wouldn't take it, so it ended up, this family in Nashville, his brother's family, sued for 20 years trying to get that money. And finally in 1961, they awarded it to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I went over there to see the building. It was finished. And I said, from 1846 to 1961, part of Isaac Franklin's money finally went to education.
What was the name of the book about the horse thoroughbreds? And
Making the American Thoroughbred by James Douglas Anderson.
Does Mr. Durham address the issue of the Trail of Tears and the Indian occupation and the Indians that might have been affected by that?
Not a lot.
The reason I ask is I have a friend who had a relative, an Indian, that actually, she says, hid out in a cave on the Cumberland. Of course, the cave's no longer here. Have you heard that story?
A lot of them hid out.
Okay.
That's where the Cherokees came from.
Okay.
Cherokee, North Carolina, and that area over there, they never left.
The school that was out there at Castalia Springs, right there where Isaac Bledsoe and them were buried, what was that? That was a school there one time, wasn't it?
Bledsoe School was there, but earlier it was Bledsoe Female Academy.
You
It was an
never,
early
you
school.
never hear anything about that.
No, the Bledsoe Female Academy was there, and it was there from the 1840s to the Civil War. And that it was a very fashionable girls' school there. And then the boys went to Rural Academy, which was a big brick house. The McKees own the property now. If you go down Rock Spring Road, you can look down a fence row, and way back in there was a big brick building. And that Rural Academy went back a long way too. It went back for the Civil War. There were a lot of private schools in this county. They believed in education. You just had to have money to go. There were private schools here in town, you know, you remember Roger Sindel. Well, he grew up on Bledsoe Street over here in his great-grandmother's house. And his great-grandmother and his grandmother had a private school in that house. And I remember he was my dad's age, and how many people remember Aunt Eliza Estes Lanier?
Yes, I remember.
You know where she lived out on Red River Road. Well, anyway, one of her birthdays, Roger Sindel was a junk dealer, and he was blown up during the war, but he never left the States. But anyway, permanently wounded from the camp, and he had the junk store. So he said, "Come with me and go out to Miss Aunt Eliza's. It's her birthday," and I think it was 97 or 8 or something. Well, she lived a long time after that. But anyway, he said, she went to school to my grandmother and great-grandmother in the house over here on Bledsoe Street. He said, I'm going to ask her about it. So we were sitting there, and he said, I don't know if my great-grandmother and my grandmother were mean old women. Of course, he didn't say anything. And she said, oh, your great-grandmother was just wonderful, she was just lovely, but your grandmother was mean as hell. That's what I thought, you know. And Liz Lanier was a rare person, and she's the only person I know, and I had a friend who lost a son a few years ago, and she was very upset about losing a son, and the only thing I could think to tell her was about the story about Miss Ann Eliza. I said, Miss Ann Eliza outlived her children and her grandchildren. And the grandchildren died first. And then both sons lived to be 83, and she outlived both of them. And you know, that's, she said when the second son died, she said, I didn't mean to outlive everybody.
She outlived 3 generations of pallbearers out in the Liberty area.
Yeah,
When the first one would die, she put the son on the list. Then he'd die, she put a grandson on the list. So she had 3
Ellie Weems
generations.
was the same way. She outlived everybody too, you know. 106 and a half. I had a relative, a distant relative when I lived in Robertson County, that died while I was living over there, and she was 111. And they tried to find out if she's the oldest person in the state, and the Social Security wouldn't tell them.
On Winchester, before the Union School was built in 1922, was there an academy, a Gallatin Boys Academy there?
That's what I'm told.
Okay.
I think so. I think it was. Yeah.
You don't have any information?
I don't have much, I've heard about that, but I don't have any information on it. Some of these schools you just don't find information on. They don't leave anything, unless you find a deed. And it's sometimes hard to find the deeds, because the deeds are the names of the trustees. If you don't know who the trustees are, you just find them by accident. And I can tell you right now, it's not easy to run an abstract than it used to be, but it's still hard because 40% of the deeds in the Sumner County Courthouse are not indexed. The old ones, pre-1948. They're not indexed. Believe me, I can take 5 pieces of property and go and do an abstract. I'm lucky if I can get 3 done. If they're properly indexed, you can do it just like that.
How
But I've
come they're
been-
not indexed?
Huh?
How come they're not indexed?
They just didn't index them. And some of the books, the indexes were removed. They're gone. Got lost.
Okay, and it can't be done again?
If you go page by page, and that's what I've had to do a lot of times, backwards. You go backwards through the books. Try that.
The cemetery out there, Shiloh Cemetery on the Enoch and the Tompkins property, any effort to preserve that cemetery?
I don't know of any. I think at one time, maybe somebody went up and did something, but
Boy Scouts, some guy
Yeah, they
with
did-
an Eagle
they did
Scout
that.
project, and I
They
took
did
him
that.
over there,
that's right.
and he couldn't climb a fence, so I thought he better get a merit badge and fence climbing. But I was there recently, within the last year. I mean, it's just gonna be gone.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
There's so many of those cemeteries.
It's off of Highway 25 on Dr. Enoch's property, and it borders, does any of that property belong to the Tompkins?
Up to the fence.
It's right there in the fence row.
Yeah. But there's so many of those cemeteries all over the place.
But that's the oldest, isn't
Probably.
What's the cemetery down behind Shiloh? You go down that road there, it's right up on the bank. It's a real old cemetery. Is that the Shiloh? That's not the Shiloh Cemetery.
it?
Shiloh Cemetery is next to the church.
That's what I thought. But there's a bunch of graves up there, and they're old. What is that?
All those, I'm not sure, I can't remember, but all those, we have the cemetery book, we reprinted that. And all those cemeteries are recorded. You can find them, there's a map in the book. And you need to look them up.
So you have that cemetery book? I'm looking for the Stratton Family Cemetery. You know where that is?
There's one, let's see, they changed the road on Harris Lane. There's a new church down in there somewhere, but
Yeah.
back in there, there's a Stratton Cemetery. There's another Stratton Cemetery, and I can tell you a story about this. Where the gap plant is. And my great-grandmother owned that place. She bought it in 1918. The powder plant was built in Old Hickory, and they had to sell to the government. She bought that place. And there was a Stratton Cemetery there. Well, when they built the Gap plant, the first building, I taught 100 years ago, and one of the guys that I taught told me there was a ghost in that building. He said we can load the elevator and send it to the next floor, and of course it just takes a few seconds, and the door opens and all the boxes open, unsealed and open. I said, I tell you why, you built that on a cemetery, Stratton Cemetery. Well, that's still going on, not but it was. Now, I've lived in several haunted houses, so when they get used to you, they quit doing things, most of the time.
Are haunted houses real?
Yes. Yep. If I start telling you those tales.
How about writing a book?
Yeah.
John?
I was going to ask, during General Patton's stay, I've heard that he stayed here at Rosemont during the tank maneuvers.
Yeah.
How well did he get along with the local population and vice versa?
I guess he got along with most of them all right, except Ms. Gill.
How's that
He's so
go?
hot with her. He complained about, she said he complained about, she was doing laundry for the officers. And said he complained about her rates that she charged. And I think she told him where to go. She could do that. In case you don't remember Joanne Gill. She was pretty good at it.
Kenneth, will you plug the cemetery tour this weekend?
Oh, yeah.
You're gonna do that?
This Saturday,
Good.
from 4 to 8, the cemetery tour will be held, and it's a fundraiser for the Sumner County Museum. The featured folks, Kenneth has written most of their scripts, and these are people from Sumner County, specifically Gallatin, who served a role in the First World War. So it's going to be real interesting this Saturday. It's a candlelight tour, and how much are the tickets?
$10.
$10. And you can also join the Sumner County Museum when you attend this function. And I put in his notebook a little honorarium, which Walter would have been pleased that we did, because we need to acknowledge the folks who entertain us and share history with us. So next week and in the following weeks, every Tuesday night from 6 to 6:30 we have refreshments, and then the hour following we have featured speakers. And next week is Judith Morgan. She's a local Sumner County gal who has written several books in recent years, and I will let her tell you about them next week. But she wrote a real interesting book about the Guild House, and what was the name of that? Langley Hall. There was a fabulous story about the mystery and love of this young couple who lived in Langley Hall.
W.Y. and Katie Trout.
And then she's also written recently a book about folks from Sumner County who served in World War I. So if you go to the cemetery tour and then come here next Tuesday, you can ask her lots of questions.
She also edited this new diary that I'm telling you about and supplemented it. But let's see. Well, let me tell them another story about Judith. Judith and I occasionally teach at the college, and I've done it 40-something years, off and on. But 2014, we both taught out there in the summer. And she had the class with this lady in it before I did, for the group. But anyway, she was standing up there talking about the Langley Hall book, and about Alvin C. York coming to Gallatin in 1919. They had a parade and it terminated at Langley Hall, and everybody ate on the lawn. She didn't know Eileen was in the class, and she didn't know Eileen. And Eileen raised a hand, and of course at that time, it had been 95 years now since that happened. Eileen raised her hand, she said, I was there, I remember it. And Judah said, I didn't know what to think. You know, I said, well, she's 101 years old, and she took 2 classes 3 days a week. She's still living, still living at home, 104. But when I got her, of course, I knew her. And I went over to Eileen, I said, this is what we're going to do. And she said, okay. So I got up there and I said, I understand there's a lady in this class that voted for Lincoln the second time.
Who was that person? I didn't understand.
Eileen Wise Byers. And she's a cousin to Juanita Wise Gorley.
Okay.
And so Juanita and her daughter went to see her a while back. And when they left, the daughter turned to Juanita and said, Mama, you know who the sharpest one in that room was? She said, yeah, cousin Eileen. Because she reads, she used to read constantly. She can't see too well now, but she used to read just constantly. She was an avid reader.
Where does she live?
Here in town. Well, she has a daughter that lives with her, Ann. Yeah, she doesn't live by herself. Okay. Amen again.